Good morning and namaste to all of you. Let's start our Tuesday class with some prayers. Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parbrahma, Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha, Om Bhurbhava Swaha, Tatsavitra Varenyam, Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi, Dhiyo Yo Na Prachodayat. Asto ma satyamya, tamso ma jyotirgamya, mrityurma amritam gamya. Om Senavavtu, Senavnatu, Saviryam Karvavai, Tejasvinavaditamastu, Ma Vidvishavai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Today's a day we read from this Uddhava Gita. And we started chapter 5, and we are looking at the summary of this chapter. So let's open our books on page number 146. And let's go towards the middle of that page where it says, this is a second full paragraph. Even if one has studied and has been taught all the Vedic literatures, if he has not developed a taste for the devotional service of the Supreme Lord, he has accomplished nothing more than his own labor. Okay, so in other words, when we studying, we are doing the sadhana, the ultimate goal is to develop love for God. Okay, one should study only those scriptures that glorify the Supreme Personality of Godhead and his transcendental pastimes, and that contain narrations of his various incarnations. By doing so, one gains the highest good fortune, whereas by studying scriptures other than these, one simply acquires misfortune. So this is this author's recommendation to us. Okay, so study those scriptures where we see which enhances our love for God. With firm determination, one should understand the true identity of the spirit soul and then give up his false identification with the material body. Thereafter, he should offer himself at the lotus feet of Lord Krishna, who is the reservoir of all love, and thus attain actual peace. The mind that is under the sway of the three modes of material nature is unable to concentrate upon the absolute truth. After many lifetimes, faithful persons who have performed sacrifices for the attainment of religiosity, economic development, and sense gratification can begin the process of hearing and chanting of the Supreme Lord's transcendental pastimes. Such persons then achieve the association of a bona fide spiritual master and saintly devotees. Thereafter, by the mercy of the spiritual master, they begin following the path of the Mahajans and thus attain self-realization. So in other words, first we want to do, the Jivatma wants to just explore, do this, do that. So after many lifetimes, we get a taste of this. We want to just enjoy the love for God. So if we feel that right now, that means we have come back again and again. We have tried everything. And desire for those should go away. Only one desire, I want to love my Lord. Having heard these instructions from Lord Shri Krishna, Uddhava further desired to hear about the characteristics of a saintly person and about various aspects of her devotional service. Lord Krishna replied that one who possesses these 26 qualities is actually a sadhu or Vaishnav. He is merciful, non-envious, always truthful, self-controlled, faultless, magnanimous, gentle, clean, non-possessive, helpful to all, peaceful, dependent on Krishna alone, free from lust, devoid of material endeavor, steady, in control of the 6 enemies of the mind, moderate in eating, never bewildered, always respectful to others, never desirous of respect for himself, sober, compassionate, friendly, poetic, expert, and silent. We saw these qualities in Bhagavad Gita also, of a Jnani and a Bhagat and a Yogi. The principal characteristic of a sadhu is that he takes shelter of Krishna alone. One who knows that Shri Krishna is the unlimited, indwelling Lord, who possesses a form that is eternal, full of knowledge and bliss, and thus engages in his service without deviation, is a topmost devotee. Lord Krishna next described to Uddhav the 64 limbs of devotional service. Among these are seeing, touching, worshipping, serving, glorifying, and offering obeisance to the deity of the Lord and his pure devotees, developing attachment for hearing the chanting of the Lord's qualities, pastimes, and so on, remaining always in meditation upon the Lord, offering everything one acquires to the Lord, accepting oneself to be the Lord's servant, offering the Lord one's heart and soul, engaging in glorification of the Lord's appearance and activities, observing holidays related to the Lord, performing festivals in the Lord's temple to the company of other devotees, with music, singing, and dancing, celebrating all varieties of yearly functions, offering food to the Lord, taking initiation according to the Vedas and Tantras, taking vows related to the Lord, being eager to establish deities of the Lord, endeavoring either alone or in association with others, in constructing for the service of the Lord. Vegetable and flower gardens, temples, cities, and so on, humbly cleaning the temple of the Lord, rendering service to the Lord's house by painting it, washing it with water, decorating it with auspicious designs. And this, the process of worshipping the deity of the Supreme Lord, is briefly described. So this was a summary of this chapter. So let's look at what Lord Krishna is saying in verse number 1 of this chapter. Badhau muktehe iti vyakya gunato mena vastutah gunasya maya mulatvan me moksho na bandhanam. The Supreme Lord said, my dear Uddhava, the 3 modes of material nature work under my control, sometimes designating the living entities as conditioned and sometimes granting them liberation. Truthfully, the living entities are never really conditioned or liberated. Just as I remain unchanged as the Supreme Absolute Truth, the Master of all potencies. In this chapter, the Lord describes to Uddhav characteristics of conditioned and liberated souls, the symptoms by which one can recognize a saintly persons, and the limbs of devotional service. The Lord tells Uddhav that his question is unnecessary because the soul is never really bound by the material nature. You remember Uddhav towards the end of the last chapter asked questions. So Lord Krishna is mentioning those questions. It is simply an illusion to think that the material body, which is created by the influence of the 3 modes of material nature, is the self. Only due to such illusion does the living entity suffer, just as one experiences distress in a dream. Of course, material nature is not an illusion. It actually exists, just as the living entities also exist, both being potencies of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is the dream that he is a part of the material nature that constitutes the illusion of the living entity. Thus, the soul is never actually bound because his existence is always superior to that of the matter. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the master of all potencies. It is only by speculation that the ignorant conditioned souls imagine that the Lord is devoid of variegatedness. Although the living entity is part and parcel of the Lord's superior potency, he now identifies with the inferior potency of the Lord and thus experiences conditioned life. You remember in Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna talked about my lower nature, my higher nature than me, and then he said nothing higher than me. Okay? So this nature, the Prakriti, is also God's, but it's a lower nature. The living entity is liberated when contacts the superior potency of the Lord, which has three divisions: Haladini, or spiritual pleasure, Sandhini, or eternal existence, and Samvit, or all-pervading knowledge. The Lord's existence is Sat-Chit Anand, and he never becomes forgetful. The living entities, however, being minute in quantity, are sometimes conditioned and sometimes liberated. The neutral state of the three modes of material nature is called pradhan. When the three modes of material nature interact, they compete for control over the tiny living entities, thus creating a variety of manifestations. When the conditioned soul desires to free himself from the entanglements caused by the modes of material nature, he must take to the devotional service of the Lord, which can elevate him to the spiritual world. In the spiritual sky, everyone possesses spiritual bodies that are not subject to change. In such a liberated state of existence, there is no possibility of being influenced by the three modes of material nature. After understanding one's eternal nature, one can see that he was never really a part of this material world. On the spiritual platform, there is no existence of the conception of liberation and bondage. Being the marginal energy of the Supreme Lord, one should use his minute independence to engage in the Lord's devotional service and thus revive his original consciousness, which is eternal, full of knowledge and full of bliss. In such a state, there is no chance of once again falling into illusion. So it's like we are here to know ourselves, the real self. And he's saying you can know it just by loving God. Loving God. Verse number 2. Shok moho sukham dukham deha patishcha maya swapno yatha atmanaha khyati samsriti natu vastavi. Just as a dream is an illusory creation of the mind, so lamentation, illusion, happiness, distress, and the bodily concept of life are simply creations of my illusory energy. That is to say, material existence is essentially illusory. So Maya is an illusion. The nature of the material bondage is being described in this verse. Lamentation, illusion, happiness, and distress are all related to the material body. Gross bodily designations are accepted by the subtle body, and thus a living entity falsely identifies himself as the enjoyer of a material nature. Material existence, which is full of lamentation and illusion, is not a factual reality because it is a temporary display of the Lord's external energy, just like a dream, and thus has no relation with the eternal spirit soul. And that's what we read in Yoga Vishishta again and again yesterday, just like a dream, just like a dream. illusioned soul forgets its eternal existence and imagines that there is no supreme truth. Even its most advanced stages, material life is simply ignorance. Just as one dreams, there is no question of a pleasant dream being more real than a nightmare. So, heavenly and hellish material existences are equally illusory. This material world is a manifestation of the Lord's external energy, just as the external spiritual sky is a manifestation of his internal energy. Although material nature is infinitely mutable and thus has no stable condition, it is real and not simply an illusion, like a mirage in the desert, because it is an emanation from the supreme reality. It is only our mistaking the material body as the self that constitutes illusion. One should therefore wake up from the dream of bodily identification and see the reality of the eternal supreme personality of Godhead. Okay, so what he's saying that this Maya is also real. It is Sat, according to this philosophy. Okay, this is a dualistic philosophy. According to dualistic philosophy, it does exist. See, non-dualistic philosophy says it does not even exist. But dualistic philosophy, Dvaita, says it does exist, but it is not permanent. It is temporary, but it does exist. Verse number 3. Vidya vidye mam tanu vidye uddhav shriri naam moksha bandh kare आधे माया में विनिर्मित है. O Uddhava, you should understand that both ignorance and knowledge are creations of my Maya. Being expansions of my potency, they are beginningless and are the cause of the living entities' bondage and liberation. Okay, so both Maya and God, they are all beginningless. That means they are eternal. But the only difference is the Prakriti changes, God doesn't change. It may be questioned how Maya, being illusion, can influence the eternal spirit, soul. The answer is that both knowledge and ignorance are two manifestations of the Lord's powerful energy, and which are the causes of liberation and bondage. Knowledge awards liberation, and ignorance causes bondage. Being creations of the eternal energy of the Lord, knowledge and ignorance are beginningless, unlimited, and inexhaustible. In the Vedic literature, it is described that the Supreme Lord has an eternal energy known as Maya, which manifests in three features: Vidya, Avidya, and Pradhan. Pradhan creates the material world. Avidya creates the conditioned souls, misconceptions, and Vidya removes those misconceptions and awards enlightenment. So Pradhan is the Prakriti. When we say Satvikta, Rajsikta, Tamsikta, that is Pradhan, which creates this material world. The living entity, being the marginal energy of the Lord, can exist under the shelter of either knowledge or ignorance. When the living entity takes shelter of Vidya, he remains in the liberated condition, and when he takes shelter of Avidya, he remains in bondage. Vidya and Avidya are the two eternal energies of the Supreme Lord. Followers of the Vishisht Advait philosophy. See, there's a Dvait, Advait, and in between is a Vishisht Advait. So followers of the Vishisht Advait philosophy address the living entities as Chit and the material world as achit. According to the Vedic statement, yatha bhasha, yatha tamaha, Shri Jeev Goswami has described the living entities as Jeev Maya and Master as Gun Maya. It is the mistaken identification of the living entities with matter that causes illusory material existence or ignorance. When the living entities can see himself as the superior potency of the Lord, giving up his misidentification with the inferior potency of matter, he can return to his blissful condition in the spiritual sky. Verse number 4. Ekasya eva mamansheh jivasyev mahamate bandho sya vidhyanardi vidhyaya chatathe tatra. O intelligent Uddhava, the eternal living entities are my parts and my parcels. For I am the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Ignorance is the cause of the living entities' bondage, and knowledge is the cause of their liberation. Okay, so again he is repeating that knowledge is the one which really liberates us. And it's not just a theoretical knowledge, again, remember, it's experienced knowledge. The two energies of the Lord, Vidya and Avidya, influence the marginal potency or living entities. When they are under the influence of Avidya, the living entities are conditioned. And when they are under the influence of Vidya, they are liberated. As stated in Bhagavad Gita. Besides this inferior nature, O mighty armed Arjun, there is another superior energy of mine, consisting of all living entities who are struggling with material nature and are sustaining the universe. In chapter 7, verse number 5. There are many statements in the Vedic literature indicating that the absolute truth is one. Here the living entities are described as innumerable, being fragmental parts and parcels of the Lord. So innumerable means you cannot number them. They are numberless. How can this apparent contradiction be reconciled? Lord Chaitanya has informed us that the living entities are inconceivably, simultaneously one with and different from the absolute truth. The external energy of the Lord has two features, avidya and vidya. Under the influence of these potencies, the propensities of the Jeev Shakti and Maya Shakti are eternally manifest. It is stated in the Vedas. He's quoting a Kathopanishad over here. The Lord is the prime eternal among all eternals. He is the supreme living entity of all living entities. And he alone is maintaining all life. See, all our scriptures, they are saying the same thing. Truth doesn't change. When the living entities are freed from the influence of avidya, they attain liberation. However, the liberation of merging into the existence of Brahman is condemned. A devotee, although united with the Lord, keeps his individuality intact. Now he talks about the Vishnu Purana. He says in Vishnu Purana, the potency of Lord Vishnu is summarized in three categories, namely the spiritual potency, the living entities, and ignorance. The spiritual potency is full of knowledge. The living entities, although belonging to the spiritual potency, are subject to bewilderment. And the third energy, which is full of ignorance, is always visible in fruitful activities. So the Supreme Lord is one without a second. So that means there are no two gods, it's only one. Supreme Lord is one without a second, and the innumerable living entities, both conditioned and liberated, are his eternal fragmental parts and parcels. The conditioned souls have been under the influence of avidya since time immemorial. However, with the help of vidya, they can attain liberation. Although the parts and parcels of the Lord are sometimes liberated and sometimes conditioned, there is no question of conditioning or liberation for the Lord Himself. Avidya and vidya can exert their supremacy over the parts and parcels of the Lord, but not the Lord Himself. So that means Lord Himself, the Ishwar, does not get delusional. Only the Jivatmas, they do. So not the Anshi, only the Ansha. Okay. Verse number 5. Ath bhadasye muktasye velakshnem vadamite viruddh dharminos tat sthityor ek dharmani. O Uddhava, I shall now describe the difference between the embodied spirit soul, who possesses the two contradictory natures of misery and happiness, and the eternally liberated Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because as Jivatma, we go through the misery and the happiness, Sukha and the Dukkha. We are bound in this duality, but God is not. In the previous chapter, Uddhav inquired from the Lord about the symptoms by which one can understand who is a conditioned soul and who is a liberated soul. In reply, the Lord explained that the characteristics of bondage and liberation may be understood in two divisions, as the difference between the ordinary conditioned soul and the eternally liberated personality of Godhead, or as the difference between conditioned and liberated living entities in the Jeev category. The Vedas confirm that the super soul is untouched by material contamination. The difference between the spirit soul and the supreme soul will be described in the following verses. The conditioned soul is full of lamentation, whereas the super soul is full of bliss. They are both situated in the same body, but one of them is fully independent and the other is completely dependent on the independent Lord. Okay, just like in the Upanishad also we read that there are two birds. Okay, and one bird is, that is the conditioned soul. Something good happens, we feel happy. Something bad happens, we are miserable. But the other one is always blissful. When the respective symptoms of the conditioned and liberated souls are carefully considered, there appears to be two contradictory natures. The conditioned state is full of lamentation, and the liberated state is the platform of boundless happiness. The super soul is the controller of all energies, and the spirit soul, being the marginal energy, is always controlled. Verse number 6. Supernav etau sadrisho sakhayo yadrichetahu krit nido chavrikshe ekasteyo khadatihi piplanam anyo nirano api balen bhuyan. There are two birds, the living entity and the super soul, who live together in a nest, heart of a tree, the material body. They are similar in nature, both being spiritual, and they are inseparable friends. One bird, the living entity, enjoys the fruit of the tree, whereas the other bird, the super soul, does not partake of the fruit because he is in a superior position on account of his potency. So just as a bird is separate from the tree he sits in, the spirit soul and the super soul are distinct from the material body, which is compared to a tree. Because both of them are of the same spiritual quality, they are naturally related as friends. Because ultimately, the whole creation is creation of God. The Maya is also God's Maya. While residing within the tree, one of them enjoys the fruit of that tree, whereas the other one simply witnesses his friend's activities. This tree of material existence has its roots upwards and its branches down, as described in the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 15. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, it is said that there is an imperishable banyan tree that has its roots upward and its branches down, and whose leaves are the Vedic hymns. One who knows this tree is the knower of the Vedas. Two birds live in this imperishable banyan tree. One of them is the living entity who engages in eating the fruit of the tree, and the other is the super soul. And fruits means the karma phala. Those are the fruits. Who does not eat the fruit but remains always self-satisfied. It is also stated in the Vedas. Two companion birds sit together in the shelter of the same peepal tree. One of them is relishing the taste of the tree's berries, while the other refrains from eating and instead watches over his head. This is from Shvetashvara Upanishad. But the same example is given in the Mudaka Upanishad too, which we are studying these days. Verse number 7. Atmanam anyam jasade ved vidvan apilado natu piplada yo vidyaha yuksatu nitya badho vidya mayo yasatu nitya muktaha. The super soul, who does not taste the fruit of the tree and who is the shelter of eternal knowledge, knows all about himself and the living entities. However, the living entity who tastes the fruit of the tree is ignorant of both himself and the Supreme Lord. So that means the watcher knows all, but the taster does not. The living entity has been conditioned by the Lord's illusory energy since time immemorial, and the Supreme Lord, who is always in full knowledge, is eternally liberated. The super soul knows himself as well as the living entities, and he does not eat the bitter fruit of the tree of material existence. The conditioned living entity, on the other hand, who tries to enjoy the fruits of his labor, neither knows himself nor the Supreme Lord. These living entities are eternally conditioned, whereas the super soul is eternally full of knowledge. The word vidya in this verse refers to the internal spiritual knowledge of the Supreme Lord, which is distinct from material knowledge. In the Gopal Tapani Upanishad, it is stated, there are two birds living as friends in the same tree, the living entity and the super soul. The living entity is a separated part and the parcel of the Supreme Lord, and he enjoys the fruits of his fruitive actions. The super soul is a plenary portion of the Supreme Lord, and he witnesses the actions of the living entities. So it looks like the same analogy has been given by so many different saints. There's always a distinction between the Supreme Lord, who is the Supreme Controller, and the living entities, who are his eternal servants. The Lord is the master of all potencies, and the living entities are subordinate to him. The Lord does not enjoy the fruits of karma, and he is omniscient. That's what Rishi Patanjali also said in Yoga Sutras. The living entity enjoys the fruits of his own karma, and he is ignorant. Due to ignorance, the living entity has been conditioned since time immemorial. If he himself as a servant of the Supreme Lord, then by the influence of spiritual knowledge, he becomes eternally liberated. In his conditioned state of existence, the living entity enjoys by acting piously and suffers by acting impiously. In the liberated state of existence, there is no question of piety or impiety because one is fully devoted to the Supreme Lord and is not attached to the fruits of his karma. See, again and again we are learning that we got to identify ourselves with the real us. We've been identifying with the false us, and that is the main problem. So vidya really means correct identification, and avidya is when we are misunderstanding who we are. Let's do one more verse. Verse number 8. Dehastho api na deh stho vidwan swapnad yathoyat. Adehastho api dehastha kumati swapan dridhyatha. A liberated soul, although living within the material body, sees himself as distinct from the body. So that means even in the body, understands I am not the body. So a liberated soul, although living within the material body, sees himself as distinct from the body. Just as one who wakes up from a dream sees that it was not his real life. An ignorant person, however, thinks the body to be the self. Just as a dreaming person takes what he sees to be his reality. So he's talking about the body, physical body. But we have moved so much into the ignorance. We think even outside of our body, our possessions, our achievements, we think that's what we are. That's like another layer of ignorance on us. In the next 9 verses, the Lord will explain the difference between the conditioned soul and the liberated soul. In a dream, one sees oneself in an imaginary body. But upon waking, one gives up all identification with that body. Similarly, one who has awakened to Krishna consciousness no longer identifies with the gross or subtle material bodies, nor does he become affected by the happiness and distress of material body. On the other hand, a foolish person does not awaken from the dream of material existence and is afflicted with innumerable problems due to false identification with the gross and subtle material bodies. One should become situated in one's eternal spiritual identity by properly identifying oneself as the eternal servant of Krishna. One becomes relieved of his false material identity, and therefore the miseries of illusory existence immediately cease, just as the anxiety of a troublesome dream ceases as soon as one awakens to his normal, pleasant surroundings. Although the subject matter of a dream may remain fresh in the mind of a person, when he wakes up, the illusory nature of the dream is immediately realized by him. However, those who are sleeping in the lap of material nature cannot realize the illusory nature of their existence until they awaken by means of self-realization. The seer himself is eternal. Seer means the Atma, part of Paramatma. The seer himself is eternal, but his dreams at night and his experiences during the day are of no lasting importance, being no better than a phantasmagoria. So in these verses again and again, he is trying to bring our attention towards who we really are. And he says by being a servant to God, That means surrendering to God. We can attain this, we can realize it by surrendering. By surrendering, we are loving God also. So let's do the Shanti part. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vishishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you very much.